Since the dawn of time, humanity has been fascinated with the mystery of the apocalypse. Although many associate this word with the end of the world, its original meaning is revealing: to unveil, to lift the veil. And what could be more fascinating than unraveling the hidden secrets of the Four Horsemen? These figures are not just symbols of destruction and terror. They may be reflections of universal forces that dwell in the human unconscious and shape the reality around us. Throughout history, the fear of the apocalypse has been used to inspire caution or submission. But what if the message contained in these symbols is much deeper? Let's re-examine these characters not as external agents, but as mirrors of the human psyche, archetypes that dance in our journey, challenging our perception and inviting us to spiritual awakening. The Four Horsemen are mentioned in chapter 6 of the Book of Revelation, one of the most emblematic and controversial texts of the Bible. Each horseman represents a powerful aspect. The first, riding a white horse, carries a bow and is crowned, bringing with him the idea of conquest. The second, on a red horse, wields a large sword and is associated with war. The third, holding scales in his hands and riding a black horse, is known as the bearer of famine. And finally, the fourth horseman, on a pale horse, carries the most feared name, Death. But why do these figures hold so much power over our imagination? Could it be that the real apocalypse occurs when we finally understand what these riders represent within us? Conquest, war, scarcity, and death are not just historical events, but psychic energies that often silently govern our decisions and reactions. Are we being driven by these forces without realizing it? The first invitation of this journey is simple, but transformative. What if, instead of fearing the nights, we learn to identify them in our own life? Conquest can be a force that propels us to overcome obstacles, but it can also transform into blind ambition. War can be a fight for justice and purpose, but within us, it could mean destructive emotional battles. Hunger can be a legitimate desire for something greater, but also the constant feeling of inadequacy. As for death, so often avoided and feared, it could be the key to true liberation and renewal. And so, a journey of decoding begins. It's not about interpreting the apocalypse as a distant event, but as a cycle of internal experiences. Many wise people throughout history, like the psychiatrist Carl Jung, have warned that when we don't acknowledge the contents of our unconscious, they manifest in the external world as fate. Could the Four Horsemen be a reminder that what we ignore in our inner world may take on catastrophic forms in our reality? The truth is that, at some point in our lives, we all encounter the charge of these forces. Who has never been overcome by the sensation of wanting to achieve something at any cost? Who has never battled with themselves in a moment of doubt and frustration? Who has never felt that something essential was missing, even when surrounded by abundance? And who has never been afraid of losing something, or someone, important? These experiences are the whispers of the nights within us. But here arises an intriguing question. If these forces are so inevitable, are we victims of them, or can we become masters of our fate? Great spiritual traditions teach us that self-control is the secret to transforming our reality. When we pause to listen to the signs, identify patterns, and understand the cycles, we begin to move from the position of puppets of fate and take on the role of co-creators of our existence. Moreover, each archetype carries a specific lesson. The White Knight, for example, reminds us that conquest doesn't have to be driven by ego or destruction, but can be an expression of purpose and growth. On the other hand, it warns us about the danger of confusing external victories with internal evolution. After all, how many material conquests have left hearts empty? The journey towards understanding the Four Horsemen is not merely theoretical. It calls us to practice. It's an invitation to observe our choices and notice how we react to life's circumstances. With every decision made out of fear, anger, or pride, A horse gallops stronger within us. But with every choice made with awareness and courage, we are the ones holding the reins. Thus, before we proceed to understand each knight individually, we need to accept something crucial. This journey is about evolution. There is no way to win without confronting, no way to transform without understanding. And understanding, in this case, means recognizing that the apocalypse is not a final event, but a process of revelation. The revelation of who we are, what we fear, and what we can become. So, with this first step, we look to the horizon and prepare ourselves to meet the White Knight. He is not just the herald of conquest, he represents the beginning of a quest that can lead us to enlightenment or trap us in an endless cycle of desire and frustration. Everything depends on how we choose to interpret the call. The question that remains is, are we ready to confront what it truly means to win? On the horizon of the symbolic apocalypse, the first to appear is the rider of the white horse. He is described as the one who carries a bow and a crown, riding triumphantly towards victory. Since the beginnings of religious and philosophical interpretations, he is seen as the personification of conquest. But the big question remains, what kind of conquest does he represent? Is it the victory of the soul over darkness, or the unchecked ambition that corrupts and destroys? The White Knight prompts a reflection on the human desire for control, recognition, and power. In many spiritual traditions, the will to conquer is a dual force. It can be the spark that drives someone to surpass their own limits, but it can also be a trap that consumes and isolates. Great leaders in history show us these two faces. Some used power to build, others to destroy. And what distinguishes a fair conquest from a camouflaged tyranny? Behind the scenes of the human psyche, achievement can mean many things. In practical terms, it may be winning an internal battle against fear, reaching a life goal, or overcoming adversities. However, the problem begins when this achievement becomes compulsive, like an endless cycle of, "I need more." Modern society often feeds this idea, exalting productivity at any cost and celebrating only those who reach the top. But what happens when the finish line is always moving? If we look at the archetype of the White Knight through a spiritual lens, it reminds us of something essential. It's not enough to win. We must question why we want to win. Often we get lost in the idea that we need to conquer something external to validate our existence. Relationships, material possessions, status, all of these can symbolize victory, but they can also hide a profound emptiness. How many times do we find ourselves exhausted, sacrificing time and health in the name of a trophy that, once achieved, does not bring the promised happiness? Carl Jung, in exploring the archetypes of the unconscious, suggested that the journey of self-mastery involves identifying and integrating primitive impulses of conquest. He asserted that the problem is not having ambitions, but allowing them to dominate our essence. The White Knight, in its most destructive form, symbolizes this trap, a cycle of conquests without clear purpose, where victory is merely another step towards the next battle. But there is also a higher dimension to this archetype. In many spiritual interpretations, the white horse is a symbol of purity, purpose, and divine mission. Conquering, in this sense, is not about dominating others, but overcoming inner shadows. When guided by the right intention, the White Knight becomes a metaphor for the victory of the spirit over ignorance and fear. It is the moment when we break through internal barriers and embrace the greater purpose of our existence. Let's recall, for instance, figures like Siddhartha Gautama, who would later be known as Buddha. His journey was characterized by the search for answers and the pursuit of self-knowledge. However, this quest began with a detachment from material desire and external recognition. Symbolically, he rode the white horse of enlightenment by choosing inner conquest over worldly glory. This example shows that the most powerful achievement is not the one visible to the eyes, but the one that transforms the heart. On the other hand, stories like that of Alexander the Great show the other side of this coin. Although he was one of the greatest conquerors in history, expanding an empire that seemed invincible, he himself is said to have stated, in his last days, that there were no more worlds to conquer. The dissatisfaction, even in the face of all he possessed, reveals the great dilemma of the White Knight in his dark form, the obsession with the next trophy. And this leads us to personal reflection. Where in our lives are we donning the armor of the White Knight? How many times do we seek victory just to fill an internal void that is not satisfied with titles, merits, or external approvals? How many times do we confuse success with purpose? However, there is a significant twist in this narrative. The knight does not need to be knocked down, but transformed. The energy of conquest is essential for human growth, as long as it is aligned with a higher purpose. After all, without the drive to win, we would never overcome challenges and would not seek to evolve. The key is in recognizing when this force becomes a burden and when it is a legitimate call to expand our possibilities. Another intriguing point is the role of discipline in this internal achievement. In many traditions, such as Stoicism, discipline is seen as a necessary virtue to tame uncontrolled impulses and maintain balance. The philosopher Seneca said, "No wind blows in favor of those who do not know where they are going." This phrase perfectly echoes the White Knight's dilemma. Without a clear direction, the pursuit of victory becomes a race in circles. Therefore, when we encounter this archetype, the most important question is not, "What do I want to achieve?" but "Why do I want to achieve?" This shift in perspective completely transforms our journey. When we understand the true purpose, victory ceases to be an external necessity and becomes an expression of our essence. Finally, the White Knight offers us a powerful invitation. Before seeking victories in the outside world, we need to look inward and win the quietest battles. True conquest is not about defeating others, but about overcoming our own limitations. And it's at this moment that we begin to take the reins of our own journey, guided not by ego, but by spirit. The final question he leaves us with is, are we willing to redefine what winning means? After the glow of the White Knight, an imposing and disturbing figure emerges. The Red Knight, mounted on his flaming horse, wielding a large sword. He carries the power of war and conflict. However, when we look more deeply at this archetype, we realize that the war he represents is not always the visible battle between armies. Often, it is a reflection of the silent war waged within ourselves. External conflicts often arise from unresolved internal battles. How many wars in the world have not emerged from inflated egos, accumulated grudges, and the inability to deal with frustrations? Similarly, personal conflicts with colleagues, family members, or even strangers are largely projections of the wars we cannot win within ourselves. The Red Knight challenges us to face this uncomfortable truth. Before we seek peace in the world, we need to find peace within ourselves. Historically, major global conflicts have been born from human desires, such as pride, thirst for power, and fear. But this same dynamic happens in our everyday life, in much more subtle situations. Think about that moment when, on impulse, we said something in a harsh tone or reacted with anger for no apparent reason. It's as if something deeper was boiling, seeking a way to explode. This internal explosion is a gallop of the Red Knight. Carl Jung described this internal war as the result of conflicting unconscious forces. When we don't pay attention to these forces, they gain strength and become destructive. The archetype of the Red Knight does not only symbolize physical violence, but also resentments, envies, unhealed hurts, and the constant struggle to maintain an image, even when it doesn't reflect who we truly are. Each time we resist the process of self-understanding, we fuel this invisible war. But is war always something negative? This is where the archetype reveals another layer. Conflict can be a necessary stage for growth and transformation. In many spiritual traditions, the inner battle is an essential process to achieve a higher state of consciousness. Not coincidentally, in various legends and mythologies, heroes had to face formidable enemies, often reflections of their own weaknesses, to emerge stronger and wiser. In the Bhagavad Gita, one of India's sacred scriptures, Arjuna, the great warrior, hesitates to fight in the war of Kurukshetra when he realizes that he would have to face people he loves. But the god Krishna reminds him that the real battle is not against others, but against his own doubts and fears. This lesson perfectly echoes the challenge of the Red Knight, learning to discern which battles are worth fighting, and more importantly, how to fight without being consumed by anger or the desire for destruction. When we look at our own lives, how many times do we fight unnecessary battles? How many times does a simple argument over something trivial turn into an emotional war that leaves deep wounds? Many of these battles are driven by the need to be right, the fear of being humiliated, or the attempt to protect an identity that we have built over time. The Red Knight reminds us that often, the price of internal war is our own peace. However, there is a way to deal with this archetype consciously: the practice of self-awareness and emotional mastery. This does not mean suppressing our emotions or avoiding conflicts at all costs, but understanding their origins and learning to respond instead of react. Stoicism, for example, teaches that true power lies in maintaining serenity, even in the face of the greatest provocations. The philosopher Epictetus said, "It's not the events that disturb us, but rather the way we interpret them." This quote is a reminder that we can choose how to respond to external and internal stimuli. Another fascinating aspect of the Red Knight is that he also represents the fire of passion. At its highest level, it drives us to fight for what we believe in, to defend our values, and to protect what we love. The problem arises when this passion becomes uncontrolled, and we start to see enemies everywhere. At this point, we lose our ability to discern and turn every disagreement into an epic battle. Many spiritual leaders and thinkers have emphasized the importance of abandoning unnecessary wars. Jesus Christ, in his Sermon on the Mount, taught about the blessedness of peacemakers. Buddha, in turn, explained that hatred will never be defeated by hatred, but only by love. These teachings point to a universal truth: the internal war can only be appeased when we let go of ego attachment and seek mutual understanding, both with others and with ourselves. However, this does not mean accepting everything passively or being condescending towards injustices. Sometimes fighting is necessary. The important thing is to differentiate the fair fight from the one that arises from the need for affirmation or anger. The Red Knight does not ask us to be weak, but rather to be wise. He teaches us that true courage lies in knowing when to lift the sword and when to let it rest. Finally, he poses a powerful question to us: are we willing to give up winning in order to preserve peace? Often, victory in an argument or conflict is merely a superficial win, while internally we come out defeated, wounded, and exhausted. By learning to discern the battles that matter, we are not becoming weak, but truly strong. The internal war is not the end, but a process of refinement. The ultimate goal is not to eliminate the Red Knight, but to transform his rage into determination and his sword into a tool of wisdom. Thus, he leaves us with a question: are we ready to fight for peace within ourselves? The vision of the knight on the black horse is unsettling. He emerges holding a scale in his hands and proclaiming a gloomy message about rationing. A liter of wheat for a denarius, 3 liters of barley for a denarius, and do not damage the oil and the wine. But what does this figure truly symbolize? Is he merely a messenger of physical scarcity, of literal hunger? Or does this image lead us to something deeper, the hunger of the soul, the existential emptiness, the feeling of inadequacy that so many of us carry. Scarcity, in the form of lack of food, goods, or resources, is a reality that has accompanied humanity since its beginnings. Wars, economic crises, and social collapses are often marked by literal hunger, by the desperation for survival. However, even in times of material abundance, many still feel hungry. This hunger is emotional, psychological, and spiritual. It arises when we believe that, despite having everything, something essential is still missing. The Black Night, therefore, does not only symbolize economic or social collapse, but also the internal collapse that occurs when we disconnect from a sense of purpose and belonging. How many times do we chase after material achievements, only to realize that, upon reaching them, we still feel an emptiness? This archetype confronts us with the following question: are we truly in scarcity, or just trapped in the illusion that we never have enough? It's important to understand that scarcity is not just an external condition, but also a mindset. When we believe that we will never have enough, whether in terms of time, money, love, or recognition, we are reinforcing an internal narrative of insufficiency. This mindset creates a vicious cycle where the more we try to fill this void, the more it seems to grow. The Black Night reminds us that often, the real battle for abundance doesn't happen outside of us, but within. The symbolism of the scale in the hands of the Black Knight is fascinating. The scale is a tool for measurement and balance, but in the hands of this knight, it seems to represent an imbalance. It's a reminder that the obsession with measuring and comparing everything in life can lead us to feel like we're constantly lacking. We live in an era where everything is weighed, calculated, and compared. Our earnings, our achievements, our appearance, even our worth as people. But do these measurements truly reflect our real value? Furthermore, the warning not to damage the oil and wine suggests that, even in times of scarcity, some precious things remain untouched. The oil and wine were symbols of healing, celebration, and spiritual abundance in ancient traditions. This could mean that even in moments of greatest material scarcity, we can still access a type of wealth that no crisis can destroy: the connection with what is sacred and essential. In spiritual terms, hunger can be seen as an invitation to awakening. Many stories of great spiritual masters began with a journey of deprivation and sacrifice. Jesus fasted in the desert for 40 days before starting his ministry. Buddha abandoned the luxuries of his palace and faced years of hardships in pursuit of enlightenment. These stories show us that scarcity, when understood and transcended, can be a gateway to inner transformation. On the other hand, when we don't recognize our internal hunger and try to silence it with distractions or accumulations, the cycle of scarcity intensifies. The feeling of "it's never enough" becomes a constant noise in our lives. We seek new jobs, relationships, purchases, and achievements, believing that the next thing will make us feel complete. But the Black Night reminds us that no amount of external success can fill a spiritual void. One of the roots of the scarcity mindset is comparison. We constantly measure ourselves against others, their possessions, their achievements, their appearances, and we forget that each journey is unique. The Greek philosopher Epictetus taught, "Do not desire what belongs to another. Strive to be fulfilled with what life has given you." This quote reminds us that true abundance is not about accumulating, but about appreciating and recognizing the wealth already present in our lives. The archetype of hunger also challenges us to reflect on the balance between desire and need. Having desires is not wrong. It is part of human nature to want to grow, improve, and expand. However, when these desires turn into absolute needs, we start to live as slaves to dissatisfaction. The Black Night invites us to discern: what do we really need to live with purpose and fulfillment? What is essential and what is superfluous? Many spiritual traditions teach us that gratitude is the antidote to feelings of scarcity. This is not about a superficial exercise of listing good things, but about a shift in perspective. When we focus on what we have, rather than what we lack, we activate a mindset that promotes abundance. This shift doesn't just alter our perception, it transforms our energy, influencing how we interact with the world and how the world responds to us. Another powerful aspect of this archetype is the call to compassion. Hunger, in any form, reminds us of human fragility and the importance of helping each other. When we recognize our own needs and pains, we become more capable of recognizing and alleviating the pain of others. Instead of seeing the other as a competitor, we can see them as a reflection of ourselves, someone who also struggles against their own forms of scarcity. Finally, the Black Knight challenges us to find true satisfaction. The question he leaves us with is our hunger for something we can hold in our hands, or for something we need to find within ourselves? Perhaps true abundance isn't in accumulating more, but in understanding that we are already complete. Thus, he leads us to an important reflection. What have we been nurturing, the feeling of scarcity or the perception of abundance? Behold, the last knight emerges, perhaps the most feared of all, the one who rides on a pale horse and carries with him a name that resonates deeply within every human being: Death. His appearance is not shrouded in glory, conflict, or ambition. He carries no crowns or swords. He is silent and inevitable. However, contrary to what many believe, the death symbolized by this knight is not just the end, but also a transition, a gateway to rebirth and transformation. In traditional narrative, the Pale Rider is the closure of the cycle. He represents the end of the human journey, whether individual or collective. But what if we look at this archetype not as a full stop, but as a comma in a story that extends beyond what our eyes can see? Many spiritual traditions teach us that death is not the end of existence, but a passage to another dimension of being. In this way, the Pale Rider does not destroy. He recycles, transforms, closes chapters to open new ones. The fear of death is one of the deepest instincts of the human being. Since time immemorial, we have sought ways to prolong life, avoid aging, and in some cases, deny the very idea of mortality. However, no matter how much we try to escape it, death remains by our side, reminding us of our vulnerability and the inevitability of the cycle of impermanence. But what would happen if we stopped fearing death and started to see it as an ally in our spiritual evolution? The Greek philosopher Socrates, in his final moments, said something impactful. Dying is just a change of residence. He reminds us that transience is part of existence and that accepting this condition frees us. When we stop seeing death as an enemy, we begin to understand that the true purpose of life is not to accumulate more days, but to live each moment with presence, meaning, and love. The archetype of the Pale Knight also symbolizes small deaths throughout our existence. Think about how many times you've had to end a cycle, leave something or someone behind, abandon old beliefs or habits that no longer served you. Each loss, no matter how small, carries with it a lesson, learning to let go and allow something new to take its place. Suffering often arises not because of the end itself, but because of our resistance to letting it happen. In nature, the cycle of death and rebirth is constant and inevitable. A tree does not fear losing its leaves in the fall because it knows they will return in the spring. Similarly, our existence is marked by phases of closure and renewal. The end of a job can be the start of a new journey. The end of a relationship can make room for self-discovery and self-love. The symbolic death of an old identity can be the door to discovering a stronger and more conscious version of who we are. The Pale Knight also brings with him a powerful warning. What do we need to let die in our lives so that we can be reborn? Often, we cling to pains, resentments, regrets, and old dreams that no longer reflect who we are today. This attachment can become a burden that prevents us from evolving. The Knight calls us to look bravely at our shadows and ask the tough question, Am I fully living, or just surviving amidst the ghosts of the past? Buddha taught that the root of suffering is attachment. The more we cling to things as if they were permanent, the more we resist the natural flow of life. Accepting death, in all its aspects, is not giving up or being indifferent, but trusting in the process of existence. By embracing losses as part of the journey, we learn to live with more lightness and gratitude. Another fascinating point about the archetype of death is its role as a universal leveler. Rich and poor, powerful and humble, everyone goes through the same cycle. It teaches us that in the end, superficial differences disappear and what remains is the essence. Death doesn't care about titles or possessions, but about what has been cultivated within us. This perspective may seem grim, but in fact, it is liberating. When we understand that we can't take any material possessions with us, our attention turns to what really matters. The experiences lived, the love shared, the legacy left in the lives we've touched. It's interesting to note that in many ancient cultures, death was not seen as a tragic event, but as a natural process of returning to the source. The Egyptians, for example, believed that death was a journey towards immortality, and preparation for it was part of everyday life. For the native North American peoples, death was a symbol of renewal and continuity, a reminder that life is an eternal cycle of transformation. The pale night, therefore, reminds us of something essential. To live fully, we need to embrace the reality that everything is fleeting. Time is limited, and each moment is precious. It challenges us to let go of futile distractions and embrace life with purpose and authenticity. By doing so, we not only lose the fear of death, but also free ourselves from the chains of fear that prevent us from living intensely. There's an important detail in the narrative. The pale horse is described as a faded color, almost spectral, representing the absence of life as we know it. But it can also symbolize a cleansing, a pale that removes the colors of the past, allowing new colors to be painted in the future. Death is not just gray and cold, it is also the blank space where we can redesign our existence with new perspectives. Finally, the pale night asks us a question that few have the courage to answer. If death came today, would you be living the life you want to live? Not as a threat, but as an invitation to reflection. He reminds us that by facing our mortality, we awaken to the urgency of living with meaning and being true to what really matters. Thus, the lesson left by the pale night is not about fearing the end, but about recognizing that every end contains a beginning. What do we let die today to be reborn tomorrow? So far, we have analyzed the Four Horsemen separately, but do these forces operate in isolation? Or are they interconnected in a cosmic choreography, influencing our thoughts, emotions, and decisions in a synchronized manner? When we look at human life, both individual and collective, it is evident that the horsemen do not arise independently, but as parts of a dynamic and interconnected cycle. Conquest, conflict, scarcity, and transition are in constant dance within each of us, moving like alternating tides throughout our journey. Imagine a life in which you are constantly striving to achieve your goals, the white horse. In the midst of this pursuit, unforeseen circumstances, insecurities, and internal or external disputes arise, the red horse. The conflict, in turn, drains your energy and leaves a feeling of loss and emptiness, the black horse. And eventually you realize that something needs to be left behind, ended, so that a new cycle can begin, the pale horse. This cycle can occur on different scales, in a single day, in a life project, or even throughout entire historical eras. These archetypal forces move in a symbolic way, but their impacts are real. In significant historical moments, we can identify this dance happening. For example, during major revolutions, we first see a desire for conquest and transformation, the white horse, followed by conflicts and struggles, the red horse, crises and scarcity, the black horse, and finally, a collapse of old structures, giving way to the rebirth of something new, the pale horse. Each cycle carries with it lessons, and the more aware we are of these forces, the more we can understand the movement of events, and above all, the internal movement of our own emotions and choices. In the individual psyche, the same pattern occurs repeatedly. The pursuit of a perfect relationship, for example, may start as a pure desire for love and connection. However, when we are not in internal harmony, this pursuit can turn into a battle for control or validation. Over time, frustrations, emotional wear and tear, and eventually, a feeling of emptiness arise. At this point, the Pale Rider approaches, suggesting that it may be necessary to die to old expectations, so that a new understanding of love and self-care can emerge. Carl Jung described these processes as movements of the collective unconscious that manifest in cyclical patterns. According to him, when we ignore these archetypal forces, they manifest destructively, both on a personal and collective level. That's why external wars often reflect unresolved internal wars, both of individuals and entire societies. Understanding the dance of the nights is therefore an invitation to observe life more consciously and with a more compassionate gaze towards our ups and downs. But is it possible to interrupt this cycle? Or does true wisdom lie in learning to dance with these forces rather than resisting them? Many spiritual and philosophical traditions teach us that the secret is not to run away from suffering, but rather to go through it with presence and understanding. Stoicism, for example, reminds us that we cannot control external circumstances, but we can choose how to respond to them. Just like in a dance, we cannot dictate all the moves, but we can learn to move with grace and awareness. There's something powerful in realizing that each night has their moment and role. The white horse drives us to dream big, but the red horse warns us about the inevitable challenges. The black horse reminds us of the importance of humility and gratitude in times of loss, and the pale horse invites us to accept that not everything is under our control, and that often letting go is the greatest act of courage. This understanding transforms life's narrative from a sequence of chaotic highs and lows into a natural cycle of evolution and maturation. Another powerful metaphor for this dance is the cycle of the seasons. Spring represents the achievement and blossoming of ideas, white horse. Summer brings the challenges and storms that test our resilience, red horse. Autumn is a time of scarcity and preparation, when we reap what we have sown, but also face the possibility of losses, black horse. And winter, like the pale horse, brings the dormancy and introspection needed before rebirth. The cycle of the seasons cannot be rushed or avoided. It needs to be fully experienced so that we can appreciate each phase of the journey. However, this cosmic dance is not merely cyclical. It is also an ascending spiral. With each cycle, we are invited to learn something new and elevate our consciousness. If we repeat the same mistakes, we will remain stuck in the same patterns, like a dancer who stumbles over the same notes. But when we dance consciously, we begin to transform the experience and build something new. It is interesting to note that this dance of the nights does not occur only at the individual level, but also in societies, religions, and cultures. Great civilizations were born from conquest. The Roman Empire, with its territorial expansion, faced internal and external conflicts, the struggles for power, went through periods of scarcity and decline, the fall of their structures, and eventually disappeared, only for others to emerge. Human history, at its core, reflects the same archetypes that inhabit the human heart. But there is an important detail. Although the cycle of the night seems inevitable, we can learn to navigate through it with more ease. True freedom is not in trying to escape from adversities, but in learning from each phase. When we accept the victory without losing ourselves in pride, the conflict without letting ourselves be consumed by anger, the scarcity without falling into despair, and the transition without clinging to the past, we find a state of peace that transcends the cycle itself. Finally, what the cosmic dance of the Four Horsemen teaches us is that life is a journey filled with contrasts. The same movement that brings us down can lift us up. The same end that causes us pain can set us free. The secret lies in recognizing that everything is in constant transformation, and that when we resist the movement, we become prisoners of our own expectations. But when we wisely surrender to the flow, we become co-creators of our existence. The question that this section leaves us with is, are we dancing with life or fighting against it? After observing the complex cosmic dance of the Four Horsemen, an inevitable question arises. What is our role in the face of these forces? Are we mere spectators, victims of uncontrollable cycles, or do we have the capacity to influence and transcend these patterns? The answer may lie in an ancient spiritual secret shared by various traditions throughout history. Self-mastery is the key to unlocking the hidden code in the archetypal forces that the horsemen represent. Self-mastery does not mean controlling everything around us, but learning to govern our own thoughts, emotions, and reactions. It's about taking the reins of our inner journey and directing the course of our life consciously. The Four Horsemen, viewed from this perspective, are not enemies to be defeated, but messengers that show us where we are stuck and where we need to grow. Let's start with the white horse, Conquest. It teaches us that there is no problem in wanting to win and expand, as long as the victory is an expression of purpose and not of ego. Self-mastery here means asking ourselves, why do I want to achieve this? If the answer is rooted in the fear of lack of worth or in the pursuit of external validation, we need to reflect. After all, what good is it to conquer the world and lose yourself in the process? In the case of the red horse, the archetype of conflict, self-mastery involves an even more challenging exercise, the ability to respond with balance rather than react impulsively. When we allow internal or external conflict to take over, we surrender power to circumstances. Great spiritual masters like Buddha and Jesus have taught us that the true victory is not in defeating the other, but in not being dominated by hatred. Self-mastery in the face of the red horse is recognizing that silence and serenity can be more powerful than 1,000 words spoken in anger. We have reached the black horse, the symbol of scarcity and hunger. The spiritual code of this archetype invites us to reprogram our minds to move from a state of lack to a state of abundance. This doesn't mean denying real difficulties, but remembering that prosperity begins internally with the ability to value what we already have. Practices such as gratitude, detachment, and simplicity help us transform the scarcity mindset into a flow of contentment. Self-mastery here teaches us that being spiritually rich is being free from the need to accumulate in order to feel complete. Finally, there is the pale horse, the archetype of death and transformation. It challenges us to accept the inevitable losses and face changes with courage. Self-mastery in the face of death is one of the greatest spiritual challenges, as it requires us to let go of attachment and trust in the cycle of life. Like a stream that does not fear the end of its course because it knows it will join the ocean, we are called to recognize that every goodbye carries with it the seed of a new beginning. Accepting finiteness is not resignation. It is a form of freedom. These teachings are present in various spiritual traditions. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius said, "You have power over your mind, not external events. Realize this, and you will find strength." This echoes the principle that, although we cannot prevent the nights from riding into our lives, we can decide how we will respond to their arrivals. Self-mastery is not just a shield against chaos, it's the ability to transform chaos into learning and pain into growth. But how to achieve this state of self-mastery? A practical approach involves 3 essential pillars. 1. Self-awareness. The first step is to recognize when we are being influenced by one of these archetypal forces. This requires constant observation of our emotions and thought patterns. When we feel an uncontrollable urge to win, a latent anger, or a sense of emptiness, we need to ask ourselves, which knight is riding within me now? 2. Self-compassion. The path of self-mastery is not about judging oneself, but about embracing oneself with kindness. We are all visited by the knights at some point. Instead of blaming ourselves for feeling fear, anger, or scarcity, we need to accept our imperfections as part of the journey. The spiritual master Thich Nhat Hanh used to say, "Take good care of your anger, as you would a crying child." 3. Daily practice. Self-mastery is a skill that is built with daily practices such as meditation, prayer, reflections, and conscious actions. It is necessary to exercise the spiritual muscle every day. Small actions like taking a deep breath before reacting or writing at the end of the day about the moments when we felt unbalanced can create significant changes over time. Another essential aspect of the knight's spiritual code is the ability to find balance. In many ancient cultures, wisdom was not just about seeking the light and avoiding the shadows, but finding a middle path that honored both polarities. Life is not made up of only victories or losses, peace or conflict, abundance or deprivation, life or death. It is a continuous flow between these extremes. Knowing how to navigate through them with serenity is true mastery. Self-control also leads us to a great lesson about responsibility. We cannot change the behavior of others or prevent challenges from arising, but we are entirely responsible for how we react to them. This power can be uncomfortable at first, because it takes us out of the position of being victims of circumstances, but at the same time, it is liberating. It is the moment when we realize that we are not at the mercy of the cycles of the knights. We are active participants in this journey. Finally, the spiritual code that emerges from the Four Horsemen reminds us that true conquest is not material, but internal. Winning means becoming master of oneself. Ending a conflict means achieving inner peace. Transforming scarcity into gratitude is the highest form of abundance. And accepting life's transition with confidence is the rebirth of the soul. The question this journey leaves us with is, are we ready to take the reins and write a new narrative, guided by self-mastery and awareness? Throughout the centuries, the figures of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse have transcended the pages of scriptures and have come to inhabit humanity's collective imagination. Depicted in paintings, legends, and stories, they have inspired profound reflections on human fate, the cycles of destruction and rebirth, and the invisible forces that shape our decisions and emotions. But what makes these symbols so powerful? The answer lies in how they resonate with universal myths, the foundations of religions, and the concepts of modern psychology. In many cultures, the archetypes symbolized by the knights appear in other forms. The white horse, for example, with its bow and crown, evokes mythological figures such as the solar hero who seeks glory, but who, if not careful, can be consumed by his own thirst for power. The Greeks told the story of Icarus, who tried to fly too high with his wax wings and ended up falling into the sea for ignoring the limits imposed by nature. Here we see the warning of the White Knight. Unchecked conquest can lead to downfall. The red horse, with its sword, echoes the archetype of the warrior in legends and religions around the world. Let's think about Mars, the Roman god of war, and Ares, his Greek equivalent. Both symbolize the destructive power of conflicts, but also the necessary strength to protect and fight for what is right. In Hinduism, we see the figure of Kali, the destructive goddess, who, despite her terrifying appearance, represents not only destruction, but also renewal after chaos. The Red Knight reminds us that conflict is part of the human journey, but we need to learn to distinguish between necessary battles and useless wars. The Black Horse, bearer of the scales and of hunger, echoes the archetype of deprivation in various religious and mythological traditions. Consider the myth of Tantalus, who was condemned to remain eternally thirsty and hungry, unable to reach the water or the fruits in front of him. This image reflects the sensation of scarcity, even when there is abundance around. However, many spiritual masters have taught that true abundance does not depend on what we have, but on our ability to perceive and value the present. The scale of the Black Rider is a powerful symbol of discernment. We are invited to weigh our desires and to recognize what is essential and what is illusion. The pale horse, associated with death, is a constant presence in the myths of various cultures. In ancient Egypt, Anubis, the jackal-headed god, guided souls to the underworld, weighing their hearts against a feather to determine their fate. In Norse mythology, Hel, the goddess of the dead, ruled over the realm of the deceased, reminding everyone that the end is inevitable. But both Anubis and Hel represented more than just the end. They were guardians of a new stage. The Pale Rider, therefore, is not just a reaper of lives, but a guardian of transitions. He reminds us that after death, whether it be literal or symbolic, there is the possibility of rebirth. Modern psychology, especially with Carl Jung, has brought a new interpretation to these myths and archetypes. Jung believed that myths were not just ancient stories, but expressions of the collective unconscious, universal symbols that inhabit all humans and reflect the internal struggles we go through in life. He identified in the archetypes a symbolic language that helps us understand our fears, desires, and dilemmas. The Four Horsemen, from this perspective, represent psychic forces that need to be recognized and integrated, not denied or repressed. For example, Jung spoke about the shadow archetype, which represents the aspects of ourselves that we prefer to ignore or reject. When we deny these aspects, they manifest in a destructive manner. The Red Knight can be seen as a collective shadow, the manifestation of conflict and violence that arises when a society suppresses its internal tensions for too long. Similarly, the Black Knight may represent the fear of existential emptiness, which is projected in the relentless pursuit of more goods and status. It's interesting to note how each religion, myth, and philosophical current interprets these forces in a unique yet essentially similar way. In Christianity, the spiritual journey is marked by challenges and trials that culminate in the promise of a new life. In Buddhism, understanding impermanence and accepting suffering are essential steps to achieving enlightenment. In both traditions, death is not seen as the absolute end, but as a stage of transformation. Another fascinating point is the way the knights can be understood not just individually, but as representations of historical eras. Many scholars suggest that the Four Horsemen appeared during times of great societal collapses and rebirths. The First and Second World War, for instance, were preceded by periods of conquest and territorial expansion, followed by devastating conflicts, scarcity, and death on a global scale. However, from these dark periods also emerged significant movements of reconstruction and learning, as if humanity had been forced to go through the cycle of the horsemen in order to evolve. But the most important question is not just historical, it is profoundly personal. How do we interpret the presence of these archetypes in our own lives? In times of crisis, it is common to feel that we are experiencing a personal apocalypse. The loss of a loved one, the end of a relationship, or a drastic change can be interpreted as the ride of one of the horsemen. But myths and traditions teach us that every end contains a revelation, an opportunity for rebirth. The apocalypse is, after all, the revelation. Finally, the Four Horsemen invite us to reflect on what we are riding towards our destiny. The historical and psychological interpretation of these archetypes reminds us that we are not mere victims of life's cycles. By understanding the symbolic power of the horsemen, we can transform them from destructive forces into allies of growth. The apocalypse ceases to be a harbinger of destruction and becomes a process of self-discovery and transcendence. The question this journey leaves us with is, are we interpreting the signs of life as an end or as an invitation to the revelation of something greater? After exploring the archetypes of the Four Horsemen and their spiritual and psychological connections, one question remains: how to apply these teachings in everyday life? After all, recognizing these forces is not enough. We need to integrate them and transform them into practices that help us live with more balance, purpose, and serenity. And for this, we need to understand that life is a continuous journey of learning, a true journey of the inner hero. In every great hero's story, the protagonist undergoes trials that profoundly transform him. He is challenged, faces losses, but in the end, returns wiser, stronger, and aware of his role. It's no different with us. Each of us lives cycles of challenges and victories, of internal struggles and inevitable changes. But as the ancient masters taught, the true hero is not the one who masters the outer world, but the one who conquers himself. The first step to applying the spiritual codes of the knights is to recognize which archetype is riding in our life at a given moment. Are we incessantly seeking a purposeless conquest? Are we in the midst of an internal conflict that consumes us? Do we feel an emptiness, a hunger that we cannot satiate? Or are we going through a loss that seems unbearable? Identifying which knight is in action is crucial, as it is only from this awareness that we can take the reins and rewrite the narrative. When the white horse appears in our life, it's time to reflect on our ambitions. Are we being guided by a genuine purpose, or are we getting lost in the pursuit of external validation? We can apply practices such as meditation and journaling to reflect on the why behind our goals. Moreover, learning to celebrate small victories and to value the journey, not just the final destination, helps us transform ambition into a positive engine of growth rather than an obsession that wears us down. In the case of the red horse, we need to learn to navigate through conflicts without becoming prisoners of destructive emotions. A powerful practice is the conscious pause. Before reacting impulsively in an argument, we can take a deep breath and ask ourselves, what do I really want with this response? Peace or victory? Another exercise is to practice empathy. Trying to see the other person's perspective can lessen the intensity of the conflict. This does not mean agreeing with everything, but avoiding being dominated by pride and anger. When we face the black horse and feel the shadow of scarcity, it's important to remember that true abundance begins in the mind and heart. Small daily acts of gratitude can transform the way we perceive the world. Writing down 3 things we are grateful for every night helps us realign our focus on what we have, rather than what we lack. Another powerful practice is detachment. Learning to let go of the superfluous, whether it is material or emotional, can free us from the constant feeling of insufficiency. Finally, when the pale horse approaches and we face losses, changes, and inevitable endings, the secret lies in embracing impermanence with compassion. This doesn't mean not feeling pain or sadness, but rather allowing these feelings to exist without resisting them. Practices such as mindful breathing and ritualized mourning can assist in this process. Ancestral cultures like the Japanese teach us that there is beauty in transience. The concept of wabi-sabi, for example, celebrates imperfection and the passage of time, reminding us that there is beauty even in things that break or end. Another essential aspect to apply these spiritual codes in daily life is not to fight against the natural cycles of life. Just as we cannot prevent the seasons from changing, we cannot avoid that achievements are followed by challenges, that moments of abundance are followed by times of loss. Wisdom lies in flowing with these cycles, rather than resisting them. As Master Lao Tzu used to say, nature does not hurry, yet everything is accomplished. A practical example of this is observing how we react to unexpected changes. Losing a job, for example, can be devastating, but it can also be an invitation to reinvent ourselves. Many success stories begin with a sudden fall, which forces the individual to explore paths they would never consider if everything were under control. When we face losses with a curious gaze, asking, "What can I learn from this?" we begin to transform suffering into growth. Furthermore, it's important to remember that we are not alone in this journey. In all great heroes' journeys, there are allies who emerge to offer support and guidance. In real life, these allies can be friends, family, books, spiritual mentors, or even moments of introspection where we receive powerful insights. Recognizing the importance of connections and seeking support in difficult times is not a sign of weakness, but of courage. Another essential point is spiritual discipline. Integrating these spiritual codes doesn't happen instantly. It requires practice and consistency. Just like a warrior trains every day to become stronger, we need to cultivate habits that help us develop self-mastery. Meditation, breathing exercises, moments of silence and reflections are like tools that help us hold the reins of our internal horses. Finally, the great lesson left by the Four Horsemen is that we don't need to fear the changes and challenges of life. They are part of the journey of self-discovery and growth. When we learn to identify their presence and dance with them, instead of fighting against them, we begin to live with more fullness and purpose. Each horseman carries a lesson, and each lesson brings us closer to who we truly are. The inner hero is not the one who feels no fear, pain, or doubt, but the one who keeps moving forward, even in the midst of storms. He understands that the real apocalypse is not the end, but the revelation, a call to wake up and take control of his own story. The final question this journey leaves us with is, are we ready to embrace life's challenges as essential parts of our awakening, and with that, become the heroes of our own journey? And now, Mind Unfettered, I want to hear from you. Which of the Four Horsemen has been riding in your life lately? Perhaps you are seeking to achieve something important, dealing with internal conflicts, facing a sense of scarcity, or learning to cope with changes and losses. Comment below. By sharing your journey, you not only reflect on what you're going through, but also inspire others who might be facing the same challenge. Remember, when we share, we collectively manifest a new reality. By creating this exchange in the comments, we strengthen the collective energy of learning and transformation. Together, we are stronger on this journey of self-mastery and evolution. And if you want to continue expanding your knowledge and uncover the mysteries behind the greatest stories of humanity, don't miss the next video that is appearing on your screen right now. Secret documents reveal the true mission of Jesus hidden by history. Prepare yourself for a surprising revelation about one of the biggest spiritual mysteries of all time. Until then, stay strong on your journey, Mind Unfettered. After all, we are infinite and unstoppable when we awaken to who we truly